The November fog of 1894 had settled upon London with unusual persistence, transforming the familiar streets into a maze of grey shadows and muffled sounds. From the windows of our lodgings at 221B Baker Street, the world beyond appeared as little more than a collection of dim shapes moving through an impenetrable veil. I sat by the fire, attempting to focus on the morning's correspondence, but found my attention repeatedly drawn to my companion, who had been pacing the length of our sitting room with the restless energy of a caged predator. Sherlock Holmes paused before the mantelpiece, his long fingers drumming against the marble surface with increasing irritation. 3 days had passed since our last case of any intellectual merit, and the enforced inactivity was beginning to tell upon his singular temperament. Oh, the scattered remnants of chemical experiments littered the table, abandoned when they failed to provide sufficient distraction from the tedium that plagued him. "Another day of criminal mediocrity, Watson," he announced suddenly, turning from the window where he had been attempting to peer through the impenetrable murk. The fog may obscure the city, but it cannot hide the disappointing lack of imagination among London's lawbreakers. I fear I shall expire from sheer intellectual starvation. Before I could offer any words of consolation, the familiar sound of Mrs. Hudson's footsteps upon the stairs announced an interruption. She entered bearing a silver tray, upon which lay a visiting card and a telegram. "The gentleman is most insistent, Mr. Holmes," she said, slightly breathless from her ascent, "and he arrived with this wire from Scotland Yard, and declares the matter cannot wait." Holmes snatched both items, his grey eyes scanning the telegram with that rapid, bird-like movement I knew so well. His expression shifted from boredom to keen interest within the span of a heartbeat. "Inspector Lestrade requests our immediate assistance," he murmured, then glanced at the visiting card. "And we have Mr. Edmund Blackwood, architectural consultant to the Metropolitan Police, waiting below. Watson, I perceive that our period of enforced leisure has come to an abrupt end." A moment later, our visitor was ushered into the room. Mr. Blackwood was a man of perhaps 40 years, with the precise bearing of one accustomed to dealing in measurements and specifications. His dark coat was damp from the fog, and his usually composed features betrayed an anxiety that seemed to war with his professional demeanour. "Mr. Holmes," he began without preamble, settling into the chair Watson indicated, "I have come regarding a death that has left both the police and myself completely baffled. The circumstances are so extraordinary that I fear you will think me mad when I describe them." Holmes leaned back in his chair, his fingertips pressed together in that characteristic gesture. "I have found, Mr. Blackwood, that the impossible merely requires a different approach to logic. Pray tell us what has occurred." 3 nights ago, Sir Reginald Pembroke was found dead in what can only be described as the most secure yet vulnerable location imaginable. Sir Reginald was an eccentric millionaire with a passion for classical architecture. 2 years passed, and he constructed upon his estate in Richmond a structure he called the Temple of Truth. It consists of 12 marble columns supporting a domed roof, but it has no walls whatsoever. The entire structure is open to the elements on all sides. Holmes sat forward, his eyes gleaming with interest. "A temple without walls. Pray continue." "The temple sits in the centre of a circular garden surrounded by a bed of fine white sand that Sir Reginald had installed to ensure complete privacy. The sand is raked smooth each evening by the gardener, creating a perfect surface that would register the slightest disturbance. On the night in question, Sir Reginald retired to the temple after dinner to read, as was his custom. When he failed to return, the household went to investigate." Blackwood paused, his hands trembling slightly as he reached for his handkerchief. "I found him seated in his usual chair in the exact centre of the temple. dead from a single knife wound to the heart. But here is the impossibility of it all, Mr. Holmes. The sand surrounding the temple was perfectly undisturbed save for Sir Reginald's own footprints leading into the structure. There were no other marks, no disturbance of any kind. The nearest cover is 50 yards away across open lawn, and the house overlooks the entire area. Yet someone approached close enough to stab Sir Reginald through the heart, and then vanished without leaving so much as a footprint in sand so fine it would show the track of a mouse. Watson leaned forward in his chair. Could the murderer have approached from above? Some form of aerial assault? Impossible, Doctor. Well, the dome is solid marble, and there are no trees or structures nearby that could provide such access. Moreover, the wound was inflicted horizontally, not from above. Holmes rose and moved to the window, though the fog rendered any view impossible. You mentioned that you are an architectural consultant to the police, Mr. Blackwood. I assume you have examined the structure personally? Indeed. Inspector Lestrade summoned me specifically because of the architectural peculiarities. I have measured every angle, examined every surface. The temple is exactly as I have described it, a room without walls in the truest sense, yet somehow the scene of an impossible murder. And the weapon? Never found. The killer took it with him when he made his phantom escape. Holmes turned back to face us. And I could see that familiar light of intellectual excitement beginning to kindle in his eyes. A man is murdered in full view of anyone who might care to observe, yet no observer exists. He is killed at close quarters in a space that offers no concealment, yet his assassin remains invisible. The very openness that should make the crime impossible to conceal has somehow made it impossible to solve. The detective moved to his desk and began gathering papers with swift, economical movements. Mr. Blackwood, you will accompany us to Richmond immediately. Watson, bring your medical bag and your thickest coat. We are about to investigate a murder committed in a room without walls, and I suspect we shall find that the absence of barriers has created the most impenetrable puzzle of all. As we prepared to venture into the fog-shrouded city, and I could not shake the feeling that we were embarking upon one of the most extraordinary cases of Holmes' career. A room without walls had somehow concealed a perfect crime, and I found myself wondering whether even my friend's remarkable powers of deduction would prove equal to so paradoxical a challenge. The fog began to thin as our hansom carried us through the increasingly quiet streets toward Waterloo Station. Holmes sat opposite me, his long frame relaxed against the worn leather seat, yet I could sense the familiar tension of intellectual excitement building within him. Mr. Blackwood fidgeted with his gloves, occasionally glancing at my companion as though uncertain whether to interrupt what appeared to be deep contemplation. You observed something about our client during his visit, Holmes? I ventured, partly to break the oppressive silence that had settled over our small party. Holmes opened one eye and regarded me with amusement. Several things, Watson, though I suspect you refer to the ink stain upon his left cuff. Not from a pen, as you might assume, but from a rubber stamp. Note the slightly mottled edge and the particular shade of blue favoured by government offices. Mr. Blackwood came directly from Scotland Yard, where he had been examining official architectural drawings before Lestrade thought to summon us. Our client nodded with evident surprise. Quite correct, Mr. Holmes. I had been reviewing the original plans for Sir Reginald's temple when the inspector requested my presence. The precision of your observation is remarkable. Elementary pattern recognition, nothing more, Holmes replied, though I detected the familiar note of satisfaction in his voice. Now, during our journey, perhaps you might elaborate upon the household at Pembroke Manor. A man's domestic arrangements often reveal more about his character than his public persona. The rhythmic clatter of train wheels soon replaced the clip-clop of hooves as we settled into a first-class compartment bound for Richmond. Through the windows, the grey November landscape rolled past, the fog giving way to a persistent drizzle that streaked the glass and turned the countryside into a watercolour study in muted browns and greens. Sir Reginald was a widower, Blackwood began, settling more comfortably into his seat as the train gathered speed. His wife died some 10 years past, leaving him quite alone in that great house. He never remarried, preferring the company of his books and classical studies. The household consists of his nephew, Arthur Pembroke, who serves as his secretary and heir presumptive. There is also Miss Caroline Ashworth, Sir Reginald's ward, whom he raised from childhood after her parents perished in a fire. The domestic staff includes the usual complement: butler, housekeeper, cook, and several maids. Most significantly, there is Thomas Wright, the gardener, responsible for maintaining the grounds and, crucially, the nightly raking of the sand surrounding the temple. Holmes leaned forward with sudden interest. This ritual of sand raking, describe it precisely. Every evening at 7 o'clock, without fail, Wright would smooth the sand with a specially designed rake, creating a perfect surface that would register the slightest disturbance. Sir Reginald would then retire to his temple at 7:30 with a book and lantern, remaining there until approximately 9 o'clock. On the night of his death, this routine proceeded exactly as usual until Miss Ashworth went to call him in and discovered the body. And during those crucial 90 minutes, no member of the household observed the temple. That is perhaps the most maddening aspect of the entire affair, Mr. Holmes. The drawing-room windows overlook the garden directly, yet, on this particular evening, it seems no one happened to glance in that direction. Miss Ashworth was occupied with her piano practice in the music room, young Arthur claims he was working in the library, and the servants were attending to their evening duties in the lower floors. The train began to slow as we approached Richmond Station. Holmes rose and gathered his coat with swift, economical movements. Routine can be both the enemy and the ally of crime, Mr. Blackwood. It creates predictability, and predictability may be exploited by those with sufficient imagination. A police trap awaited us at the station, and within a quarter hour we were rattling through the tree-lined avenues of Richmond's more fashionable district. The Pembroke estate emerged from the mist like something from a Gothic romance, a sprawling Georgian manor of weathered stone, its windows dark with drawn blinds, and an air of recent tragedy hanging over the grounds like a shroud. Inspector Lestrade met us at the entrance, his sharp features drawn with frustration. Mr. Holmes, I confess myself completely baffled. I have examined every inch of that confounded structure. I questioned every soul in the household, and I am no closer to understanding how this murder was accomplished than I was 3 days ago. Inspector, I trust the scene remains undisturbed. Completely untouched, as you requested. The body has been removed to the mortuary, but nothing else has been altered. We've had constables posted around the perimeter since dawn. Through a gap between the house and its eastern wing, I caught my first glimpse of the infamous Temple of Truth. 12 white marble columns supported a domed roof, the entire structure gleaming pale against the darker landscape. Even from this distance, I could see the circle of pristine white sand that surrounded it, smooth as fresh snow and unmarked, save for a single line of footprints leading inward to the centre. Holmes stood motionless for a long moment, and his keen eyes taking in every detail of the scene. Then, with characteristic decisiveness, he strode toward the garden. "Come, Watson, let us examine this room without walls and discover how it has managed to conceal a perfect crime." As we approached the temple, I felt an involuntary shiver that had nothing to do with the November chill. The impossible nature of the crime seemed to emanate from the very stones, challenging every assumption about murder and human capability. Holmes halted at the very edge of the circular bed of sand, raising his hand to prevent our advance. The white surface stretched before us in an unbroken expanse, perhaps 30 feet in diameter, its pristine smoothness broken only by that solitary trail of footprints leading directly from where we stood to the temple's center. The afternoon light, filtered through the persistent drizzle, gave the marble columns an almost ethereal quality as they rose like pale sentinels around the covered space. "Not another step, gentlemen," he said quietly, his voice carrying that note of absolute authority I knew so well. "We must preserve this tableau exactly as it appears. A single careless footprint could obliterate the one honest witness to this affair." He crouched at the boundary where lawn met sand, withdrawing his magnifying glass with practiced precision. "Observe, Watson, how the gardener's work achieves surgical precision. Each rake mark creates perfect parallel ridges beneath the surface, like the grain in fine wood. Any disturbance would be immediately apparent even in lamp light." Inspector Lestrade shifted impatiently behind us. "We've established that much already, Mr. Holmes. The question remains, how did the murderer cross this surface without leaving a trace?" "Perhaps the more pertinent question, Inspector, is whether he crossed it at all," Holmes replied, beginning a methodical circuit of the perimeter. His keen eyes swept across every inch of the sand's edge, occasionally pausing to examine some detail invisible to our less practiced observation. I watched as he studied the single set of impressions with particular intensity, measuring their depth and spacing with his small tape measure. Sir Reginald walked calmly to his accustomed seat, Holmes observed, straightening from his examination. No suggestion of haste or hesitation. The stride remains uniform throughout, the depth consistent with a man of perhaps 11 stone moving across dry sand. He approaches alone, arrives alone, and yet does not depart. After completing his circuit, Holmes turned his attention to the temple itself. The 12 Doric columns rose from marble bases embedded directly into the sand, supporting a dome that created a perfect circle of shelter while leaving the periphery completely exposed. Without warning, he stepped directly onto the sand, ignoring Lestrade's gasp of alarm. "I must examine the scene from within," he called back, his boots leaving clear impressions as he followed Sir Reginald's path to the centre. "Remain there, Watson. I wish to disturb as little as possible." From his position beside the chair, Holmes surveyed the view through the columns. From this vantage point, one commands a clear prospect in all directions. Yet Sir Reginald saw nothing that alarmed him sufficiently to rise.
The killer approached close enough to strike a fatal blow, yet the victim remained seated, reading by lamplight. He bent to examine the chair itself, then knelt beside it with his magnifying glass. Blood concentrated directly beneath the chair and pooling slightly to the left, consistent with a single, precise thrust to the heart. Death would have been rapid, though perhaps not instantaneous. His attention shifted to a small table beside the chair, bearing an extinguished lantern and an open book. But it was the polished granite floor that seemed to capture his interest most completely. "Watson, observe these faint circular marks near the table leg. Dust rings, perhaps 2 inches in diameter. The granite is otherwise spotless, suggesting these impressions are recent. Whatever created them has been removed." Holmes moved to the edge of the temple floor, peering intently at the base of one column. He wetted his finger and rubbed a spot on the marble, then examined his fingertip with evident satisfaction. "Graphite," he announced, his voice sharp with excitement. "Finely powdered graphite, a lubricant, Watson, often used in machinery to reduce friction." He stood, his energy renewed by this discovery. Note also the absence of watermarks on this polished surface. It was drizzling on the night of the murder, yet no damp footprints disturb the granite. If our killer had crossed wet grass and somehow leaped the sand, his shoes would have been wet. The absence of such marks is as significant as the absence of footprints in the sand itself. Returning across the sand via his own footprints,
And Holmes rejoined us with that purposeful stride I recognized as the prelude to intensive investigation. The physical evidence has provided several threads to follow, but we must now examine Sir Reginald's private papers. A man's study often illuminates the shadows his public life casts. We return to the manor through a side entrance, the wood-panelled corridors hushed with the peculiar atmosphere that settles over a house touched by sudden death. The butler, Mr. Graves, appeared silently to guide us to Sir Reginald's study, a corner room whose tall windows commanded views of both the front drive and the eastern garden where the temple stood. Holmes immediately moved to the massive mahogany desk, sorting through correspondence and documents with swift efficiency. He paused over a leather-bound diary, but reading several entries with growing interest. Sir Reginald was methodical in his habits, he remarked, holding up the volume. His final entry notes an expected visitor at 8:30, requiring him to conclude his temple reading early. Yet no one mentioned any expected caller. His attention shifted to the bookshelves lining the western wall, his fingers tracing along the spines until he reached a conspicuous gap. The dust pattern indicated a large volume had been recently removed. "A book is missing from this collection," he observed, turning to Graves. "What occupied this space?" The butler's composure flickered momentarily. "Sir Reginald's personal journal, sir, a large red-leather volume containing his private thoughts. I have not seen it since the day before his death." Holmes's eyes gleamed with sudden intensity. "Now that,
gentlemen, is a detail of considerable significance. Inspector, I shall require interviews with the entire household, beginning with the gardener, Thomas Wright. But first, show me every room that commands a view of the temple."
Somewhere among these ordinary details lies the single extraordinary fact that will unlock this room without walls. As we prepared to continue our investigation, I could not shake the feeling that Holmes had already begun to perceive the outline of a solution to this impossible crime. The missing journal, the mysterious visitor, the graphite lubricant, and those enigmatic dust circles were beginning to form a pattern that only his remarkable mind could fully comprehend. Holmes insisted we begin our examination with those rooms commanding the clearest prospect of the temple grounds. Lestrade led us along the first-floor corridor, where several chambers faced eastward toward the garden. Holmes moved from window to window with characteristic precision, pausing only long enough to register each viewing angle before proceeding to the next. At the third door, however, he halted abruptly, his keen eyes focusing with sudden intensity. "Sir Reginald's bedchamber?" he inquired, indicating the heavy oak portal. "Indeed," Lestrade confirmed, though he rarely occupied it in recent years, preferring smaller quarters on the ground floor. This room was maintained primarily for formal occasions. Holmes stepped inside without further ceremony. The chamber was spacious and elegantly appointed, yet possessed that peculiar stillness of a room more admired than inhabited. Crossing directly to the tall windows, that he drew back the heavy curtains and gestured for us to observe the view. From this elevated position, the Temple of Truth lay almost directly ahead, the circle of white sand appearing as a luminous disk against the darker lawn. "An unobstructed prospect indeed," Holmes murmured, his gaze sweeping the landscape below. Even on the mistiest evening, any figure approaching or departing the temple would be clearly visible to an observer stationed here. His attention shifted to the window sill, where a faint smudge of ash marred the otherwise pristine wood. Someone has stood at this window recently, smoking tobacco of a distinctly inferior quality. The ash is fresh, the blend coarse enough to suggest common shag, rather than the refined mixtures a gentleman of Sir Reginald's station would favour. Lestrade frowned thoughtfully. Ox the gardener Wright smokes such tobacco, I believe. Young Arthur Pembroke favours Turkish blends, while the household staff are forbidden to smoke within the manor. Then we must certainly interview Mr. Wright with particular attention to his evening observation, Holmes replied, his eyes bright with interest. But first let us complete our survey of potential vantage points. We descended to examine the music room, a gracious chamber on the ground floor, dominated by a magnificent grand piano. Here the view of the temple was partially obscured by ornamental yew trees, though the glow of Sir Reginald's reading lantern would certainly have been visible through the columns. Holmes examined the window frame with his customary thoroughness, but discovered nothing beyond traces of furniture polish. From this position, he observed, one might detect the presence of light within the temple, but would struggle to discern specific details of movement or activity. Yet any shadow crossing that illuminated space would be unmistakable. Thomas Wright awaited us in the servants' hall, a weathered man whose calloused hands and stooped shoulders spoke eloquently of decades spent in honest outdoor labour. He twisted his cap nervously between his fingers, clearly uncomfortable under the scrutiny of Scotland Yard, though Holmes adopted a reassuring manner that soon put him somewhat at ease. "Mr. Wright, your maintenance of the temple grounds is exemplary," Holmes began, settling into his chair with an air of casual conversation. "The sand raking in particular demonstrates remarkable precision. I understand this task occupies you each evening at 7 o'clock?" "Aye, sir."
"Odds without fail," Wright replied, his country accent thick, but his words clear. "Takes me near 20 minutes to get it perfect, working from the outside in circles until I reach the temple steps. Sir Reginald was most particular about that sand being smooth and undisturbed before his evening reading. And on the night of his death. Was there anything unusual about your routine?" Wright's weathered brow furrowed in concentration. "Not unusual exactly, sir, but young Mr. Arthur came out whilst I was finishing up. Stood there on the lawn watching me work for a good 5 minutes or more. Never showed much interest in the gardening before, so it struck me as peculiar. Asked me questions about the rake, how heavy it was, how the sand needed to be prepared just so." Holmes leaned forward with evident interest. "Indeed. And what was your impression of his manner during this conversation?" "Seemed nervous-like, sir. Kept glancing toward the house, then back at me working. Asked if anyone ever walked across the sand after I'd finished raking it, which seemed an odd question since he knew well enough that only Sir Reginald was permitted." "After completing your work, what did you observe?" "I put away my tools and was cleaning them in the shed when Sir Reginald came out at 7:30, carrying his lantern and book as usual. Watched him walk straight across to his chair, same as he'd done countless times. Then I went in for my supper with the wife. Didn't see another soul about until Miss Caroline started screaming near an hour later." Following Wright's dismissal, Holmes requested an interview with Miss Caroline Ashworth.
She entered the drawing room moments later, a slender young woman of perhaps 25 years, whose pale features and shadowed eyes spoke eloquently of recent grief. Her dark dress was severe in its simplicity, and I noticed her hands trembled slightly as she took the seat Holmes offered. "Miss Ashworth, please accept my condolences on your loss," Holmes said with uncharacteristic gentleness. "I understand Sir Reginald served as both guardian and benefactor following your parents' death." "He was everything to me, Mr. Holmes," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "When the fire took my parents, Uncle Reginald opened his home without hesitation, He educated me, cared for me, as though I were his own daughter. I cannot comprehend who would wish him harm. In the days preceding his death, did Sir Reginald seem troubled or preoccupied? Did he mention any concerns or unusual correspondence? Miss Ashworth hesitated, her fingers working nervously at her handkerchief. He had been somewhat distracted for perhaps a week. I noticed him spending more time than usual in his study, and he seemed to be expecting something in the post. 3 days before his death he received a letter that appeared to disturb him greatly. I saw him read it at breakfast, and his face went quite pale. When I inquired whether something was amiss, he dismissed my concern rather sharply and retired immediately to his study with the letter. Holmes exchanged a significant glance with Inspector Lestrade. When we examined the study earlier, no such correspondence was evident among his recent papers. Do you know what became of this letter? I assumed it remained among his private documents, though I confess I have not had the heart to sort through his personal effects since the tragedy. Miss Ashworth, I must ask a delicate question regarding household relationships. Were there any tensions or disagreements that might have created resentment? She twisted her handkerchief more tightly, clearly uncomfortable with the implication. Arthur and Uncle Reginald had their differences, as any two strong-willed men might. Arthur felt his uncle was too conservative in managing the estate, too devoted to his classical studies, and insufficiently attentive to modern business opportunities. But these were minor disagreements, surely nothing that would lead to violence. At that moment, Arthur Pembroke himself entered the room, his handsome features marred by evident irritation. "Caroline, you should be resting rather than submitting to this interrogation," he said protectively, moving to stand beside her chair. "Inspector, surely these questions can wait until my cousin has recovered from her shock." Holmes studied the young man with that penetrating gaze I knew so well. "Mr. Pembroke, your concern for Miss Ashworth is commendable. Perhaps you might assist us by explaining your conversation with the gardener on the evening of your uncle's death. Mr. Wright mentioned your sudden interest in his raking technique." Pembroke flushed deeply, his composure faltering. "I was merely making conversation. Is it now a crime to take interest in the estate's maintenance? Not a crime, certainly, but perhaps a coincidence worth noting. You are an engineer by training."
Are you not? I am, though I fail to see the relevance. An engineer would naturally appreciate questions of mechanics and precision, Holmes replied smoothly. Tell me, did your uncle ever discuss the temple's construction with you? The foundation work, perhaps, or any unusual structural features? Never. He considered it his personal project and consulted no one regarding its design. I knew nothing of its construction until it was completed. After the interviews concluded, Holmes began pacing the drawing room with that restless energy indicating intense mental activity. "The pattern becomes clearer, Watson," he murmured, pausing before the window overlooking the garden. "First, a personal journal vanishes, now correspondence that clearly disturbed Sir Reginald. Someone has been systematically removing documentary evidence, and yet they left the body displayed in the most impossible location imaginable." He turned to face us, his eyes bright with the light of deduction. "Why conceal papers, but exhibit the corpse? The answer lies in understanding what the murderer feared those documents might reveal, and why the method of killing was designed to appear impossible rather than merely concealed. We are dealing with someone who wishes to create a puzzle rather than simply escape detection." Lestrade shifted impatiently. Perhaps young Pembroke is our man. He stands to inherit. He had disagreements with the deceased, and his sudden interest in the crime scene preparation seems highly suspicious." "Perhaps," Holmes replied, though his tone suggested considerable skepticism. Yet we must not allow motive to blind us to method, Inspector. Arthur Pembroke may have desired his uncle's death, but desire and accomplishment are separated by that pristine expanse of sand. Before we can accuse anyone, we must first understand how the impossible was rendered possible. He moved to the window once more, his gaze fixed upon the temple, where the afternoon light cast long shadows between the columns. There is a deception here, Watson, an elegant deception that transforms the very openness of the crime scene into the perfect concealment. The answer lies not in who crossed the sand, but in whether anyone crossed it at all. Holmes requested that we return to the temple before the light failed entirely, insisting that certain observations required the particular quality of evening illumination. The November dusk was settling over the garden as we made our way across the damp lawn, with the white circle of sand appearing almost luminous against the darkening grass. Inspector Lestrade followed reluctantly, clearly sceptical of what further secrets the crime scene might yield after such thorough examination. "Watson," Holmes said quietly as we approached the perimeter, "remind me of the precise timeline. The gardener completes his raking at 7, Sir Reginald crosses at 7:30, and the body is discovered at 9. Yet we have confirmed that no one else approached the sand during that critical period." "That appears to be the case," I replied, though even as I spoke the words, the impossibility of the situation struck me anew. Wright saw Sir Reginald walk to the temple alone, and no member of the household admits to venturing near the garden afterward. Holmes nodded grimly. 3 separate forms of evidence, Watson. The testimonial evidence of multiple witnesses, the physical evidence of undisturbed sand showing only Sir Reginald's footprints, and the medical evidence of a wound inflicted at close quarters. Each form of evidence is individually reliable, yet collectively they describe an impossibility. Such contradictions never arise by accident. Rather than crossing the sand as he had earlier, Holmes began a methodical circuit of the perimeter, his attention focused not on the ground, but on the marble columns themselves. At the 4th pillar, he suddenly halted and knelt in the damp grass, pressing his fingers along the base where the marble met the sand. I observed him probe carefully at what appeared to be a narrow groove, barely visible in the failing light. His expression when he rose carried that unmistakable gleam of discovery that I had learned to recognize over our years of partnership. Without explanation, he continued around the temple, pausing briefly at 2 other columns before rejoining us with evident satisfaction. "Inspector," he announced, "I must insist that this garden remain absolutely undisturbed for at least another day. The sand, in particular, must not be approached by any member of the household. Station your constables at 20-foot intervals around the perimeter." Lestrade bristled at the instruction. "Holmes, we've had men patrolling day and night already. Surely you don't expect the murderer to return and admire his handiwork." "Whether he returns is immaterial," Holmes replied with characteristic calm. "The crime scene continues to yield information, but only if we preserve its integrity, or disturb it prematurely, and we may silence the most eloquent witness to this entire affair." As we walked back toward the manor, I fell into step beside my friend. "You've discovered something significant, haven't you?" He smiled faintly. "I have detected an inconsistency between the temple's apparent design and its actual condition, Watson. Until I can confirm my suspicions through additional investigation, it would be premature to share them, even with so trusted a chronicler as yourself." Our next destination was Sir Reginald's study, where Holmes requested that all locked compartments be opened in our presence. Under the supervision of Mr. Graves, we examined drawers, cabinets, and a handsome iron safe concealed behind a panel of false books. The safe contained various legal documents and investment papers,
came but none of the missing items Miss Ashworth had described. Holmes moved through these papers with practiced efficiency, pausing over a collection of correspondence bound with blue ribbon. Sir Reginald maintained extensive interests in South African ventures, he observed, showing me references to copper mining rights and transport concessions. Note the substantial returns on these investments, Watson, while his nephew's engineering enterprises appear to have encountered considerable difficulties. His attention then shifted to the writing desk itself, where his fingers discovered a small key hidden in a secret compartment within the main drawer. "Every cautious man maintains a private space within his private space," he murmured, using the key to open a concealed panel. The compartment was empty, but Holmes examined it carefully with his magnifying glass. "The personal journal was kept here," he concluded, noting the dust patterns within. "Removed recently, but with the proper key rather than by force. Our thief possessed intimate knowledge of Sir Reginald's habits and hiding places. Before returning to our lodgings, Holmes insisted upon a brief examination of Sir Reginald's body at the Richmond mortuary. The attendant had unfortunately cleaned the deceased's shoes, but traces remained in the leather stitching that caught Holmes's attention immediately. "Observe this greenish residue, Watson," he said, indicating faint stains barely visible in the gaslight. "What does it suggest to you?" I examined the substance carefully. "It appears to be verdigris, from the oxidation that forms on copper or bronze when exposed to moisture." "Precisely. Yet I observed no such material in the garden or upon the temple floor. Sir Reginald encountered oxidized metal somewhere during his final journey, though where remains another puzzle piece to be fitted into our growing collection. The wound itself proved equally instructive. A single, precise thrust between the ribs angled upward to pierce the heart with surgical accuracy. The weapon had been narrow and exceptionally sharp, wielded with either considerable skill or extraordinary fortune. Most significantly, Sir Reginald's hands bore no defensive wounds whatsoever. He made no attempt to ward off the attack, I observed. Either death came with such swiftness that reaction was impossible, or he trusted his killer completely until the final moment. "The latter seems more probable," Holmes replied thoughtfully. "The positioning suggests he remained seated throughout the encounter, reading peacefully until the moment of the attack. This was not a struggle or confrontation, but an execution carried out by someone Sir Reginald had no reason to fear." As our cab carried us back through the foggy London streets, Holmes sat in contemplative silence, his sharp features illuminated intermittently by passing street lamps. I could sense the familiar tension of intense mental activity, the process by which he assembled seemingly unrelated observations into coherent theory. "The pieces begin to form a pattern, Watson," he said at last. "A man discovers some damaging truth, records it in his private journal, and receives correspondence that disturbs him greatly. Both documents vanish after his death, removed by someone with intimate knowledge of his personal habits. Meanwhile, the murder itself is accomplished in a manner so apparently impossible that it diverts attention from motive to method." "You believe the impossibility is deliberate misdirection?" "I am beginning to suspect as much. The killer possessed both the knowledge to remove the documentary evidence and the ingenuity to create a perfect locked-room mystery. Such a combination suggests someone of considerable intelligence and familiarity with the household." Holmes leaned back against the worn leather seat, his eyes reflecting the dim light filtering through the cab's windows. "Tomorrow, Watson, we shall return to examine that temple with fresh understanding."
The room without walls has kept its secret admirably, but I believe we are approaching the moment when even the most ingenious deception must yield to methodical investigation. The fog seemed to thicken as we approached Baker Street. wrapping the familiar streets in an impenetrable shroud that matched the mystery surrounding Sir Reginald's impossible death. Yet I detected in Holmes's manner that subtle shift indicating he had begun to perceive the outline of a solution, though the complete picture remained tantalizingly beyond our grasp. Holmes was already dressed and examining a collection of architectural drawings when I descended to our sitting room the following morning. The papers, spread across our table in precise arrangement, appeared to be detailed technical specifications for classical column construction,
to complete with measurements and mechanical annotations. "I spent the early hours at the British Museum's architectural collection, Watson," he announced without looking up from his work. The librarian was most accommodating, even at such an unseemly hour. These drawings illustrate various methods by which apparently solid stone columns may incorporate hidden mechanisms while maintaining their structural integrity. Before I could inquire further, Mrs. Hudson appeared with the Morning Post, including an urgent telegram from Inspector Lestrade. Holmes read it quickly, his expression shifting from interest to grim satisfaction. "Arthur Pembroke has been taken into custody," he reported. "Sir Reginald's missing journal was discovered concealed beneath a loose floorboard in his chambers during a second search." "Then the case is resolved?" "On the contrary, Watson, it has become infinitely more complex. The journal's discovery is remarkably convenient, appearing precisely when the investigation seemed to stall. Such timing suggests deliberate placement rather than careless concealment." Holmes folded the telegram with characteristic precision. "Moreover, I received word from Richmond Hospital that the gardener Wright briefly regained consciousness during the night. His statement, though cryptic, may prove illuminating." We departed immediately for Richmond, where the hospital staff permitted us a brief interview with the injured gardener. Wright lay pale and weak against his pillows, his head swathed in bandages, but his eyes held a clarity that encouraged hope for his recovery. "Mr. Wright," Holmes said gently, "you mentioned something to the nurse about columns moving. Can you elaborate on what you observed?" The gardener's weathered features creased with concentration. "I was having my pipe at the bedroom window, sir, looking out over the garden after my supper. The master was in his temple, reading by lamplight as usual. But then I saw something that shouldn't have been possible." "What did you see?" "The columns, sir. They moved. Not all of them, mind you, but 2 or 3 shifted position while I watched, like they were turning on some hidden pivot. I thought my eyes were playing tricks, what with the lamplight and shadows, but I'm certain of what I saw." Holmes leaned forward intently. "Did you observe anyone near the temple when this occurred?" "That's the peculiar thing, sir. I saw the columns move, but no person caused it. They shifted of their own accord, if you take my meaning. Then perhaps 10 minutes later they moved back to their original positions. The whole business lasted no more than a quarter hour." After leaving the hospital, Holmes insisted we return immediately to Pembroke Manor. "Wright's observation confirms my growing suspicion, Watson. The Temple of Truth is not merely a classical folly, but a sophisticated mechanical device. Those columns are designed to move, creating temporary passages while maintaining the appearance of solid construction." Upon our arrival, we found the household in considerable agitation. Mr. Graves informed us that Arthur Pembroke had been arrested at dawn, protesting his innocence with considerable vehemence. Miss Ashworth remained secluded in her chambers, reportedly overcome with distress at these developments. Holmes proceeded directly to the temple, where he began a methodical examination of each column base. At the 4th pillar he discovered what he sought, a narrow gap between the marble casing and its foundation, barely visible unless one knew precisely where to look. "Observe this joint, Watson," he said, indicating the hairline seam. "The column is mounted on a central pivot mechanism, allowing it to rotate perhaps 30 degrees in either direction. When turned, it would create a gap wide enough for a man to pass through, yet from any distance the temple would appear unchanged. He moved to examine the adjacent columns, finding similar evidence of mechanical construction. Much of the graphite we discovered serves as lubricant for these pivot mechanisms. The verdigris on Sir Reginald's shoes indicates contact with the bronze fittings that enable this rotation. Our victim was not murdered by someone who crossed the sand, but by someone who emerged from within the temple structure itself. As Holmes continued his examination, a disturbing realization began to form in my mind. "Holmes," I said quietly, "if the temple's mechanical nature was unknown to the household, how did our murderer possess such detailed knowledge of its operation?" My friend straightened slowly, his grey eyes reflecting a growing comprehension that mirrored my own concern. "An excellent question, Watson. The answer suggests that our killer possessed intimate familiarity with the temple's design and construction. Such knowledge would be available to very few individuals." He paused, his gaze shifting toward the manor house where our investigation had begun. "I begin to suspect that we have been examining this case from an incorrect assumption, Watson. We have sought the murderer among Sir Reginald's household and associates, yet we may have overlooked the most obvious possibility of all." Holmes turned to face me directly, his expression grave with implication. "What if the murderer did not need to infiltrate the household because he was already welcomed as a trusted advisor to the investigation itself?" The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the temple grounds as the full implications of this possibility settled over us like a gathering storm. Our pursuit of an impossible murder was about to reveal a deception far more elaborate than either of us had initially conceived. Before I could fully grasp the implications of Holmes's startling suggestion, he was already moving with renewed purpose toward the temple's base. The possibility that our architectural consultant might himself be the architect of this elaborate deception cast every previous interaction in a sinister new light. "Watson," Holmes said quietly, kneeling beside the fourth column where he had earlier detected the mechanical joint, "observe how perfectly this mechanism has been concealed. The craftsmanship is extraordinary, requiring not merely theoretical knowledge, but intimate familiarity with the actual construction process. Such expertise would be possessed by very few individuals." He ran his fingers along the marble base, feeling for the hidden pivot mechanism. "Consider also the timing of Mr. Blackwood's involvement. He appeared at Scotland Yard examining architectural plans before Lestrade thought to summon us, then arrived at Baker Street with a prepared narrative emphasizing the crime's impossibility. Rather than investigating all possibilities, he directed our attention toward the very mystery he had created. The full audacity of the potential deception began to crystallize in my mind. He inserted himself into the investigation to control our understanding of the crime scene. Precisely. And having done so, he could ensure that certain crucial details remained unexamined while others received undue emphasis. Holmes straightened, his grey eyes bright with the clarity of emerging truth. "We must return to the manor immediately, Watson. If my suspicions prove correct, we shall find documentary evidence of a connection between Blackwood and Sir Reginald that extends far beyond professional consultation. Our search of Sir Reginald's private papers yielded results more damning than even Holmes had anticipated. Hidden within a locked compartment of the desk, we discovered a folder containing correspondence dating back 3 years to the temple's original design phase. The letters revealed that Blackwood's architectural firm had submitted detailed proposals for the structure, including comprehensive specifications for the rotating column mechanism. "Here is our first thread," Holmes announced, scanning the correspondence rapidly. Blackwood invested considerable time and resources developing the innovative design for the rotating columns. His proposal was ultimately rejected in favor of a less expensive contractor, but not before he had created detailed working drawings of every mechanical aspect. The correspondence grew increasingly bitter as it progressed. Sir Reginald had not merely rejected Blackwood's proposal, but had subsequently appropriated key elements of the design, filing patents for the rotating column system under his own name. Blackwood's protests were dismissed with cold legality, leaving him with no recourse despite his clear claim to the invention's intellectual origins. "The motive becomes clear," Holmes observed, holding up a particularly heated exchange of letters. "Professional humiliation compounded by financial loss."
Arm then transformed into murderous rage when Sir Reginald's patents began attracting commercial interest. The missing journal likely contained Sir Reginald's own account of how he appropriated Blackwood's innovations. Holmes began pacing the study with that restless energy that indicated his mind was rapidly assembling the complete picture. Now observe how methodically our architectural murderer planned his revenge. He possessed intimate knowledge of the temple's mechanical secrets, having designed them himself. He could predict Sir Reginald's evening routine with precision, having observed it during previous visits to discuss the original construction. But how did he gain access to the temple undetected? I asked, still struggling to envision the practical execution of such an elaborate scheme. Because he never needed to cross the sand at all, Watson. Consider the timeline. The gardener completes his raking at 7 o'clock, creating the pristine surface that would register any disturbance. But what if Blackwood was already concealed within the temple structure before that raking began? The hollow spaces behind the rotating columns would provide perfect concealment for a man of moderate build. Holmes moved to the window overlooking the garden, his keen eyes studying the temple's silhouette against the darkening sky. Blackwood arrived during the afternoon, perhaps claiming some legitimate architectural business. He concealed himself within the column structure well before Wright began his evening preparations. When Sir Reginald arrived at 7:30 and settled into his customary reading,
Blackwood emerged from his hiding place. "The confrontation must have been brief," I observed, remembering the medical evidence. Sir Reginald showed no signs of struggle, suggesting he was taken completely by surprise. Indeed, Blackwood likely attempted one final negotiation, demanding acknowledgement of his design contributions. When Sir Reginald refused, the knife ended the discussion permanently. Blackwood then retreated into the column structure, rotated the mechanisms back to their original positions using the interior controls, and waited for complete darkness before making his escape across the grounds. The calculated nature of the crime was breathtaking in its audacity. He then presented himself at Scotland Yard the following morning as the concerned architectural consultant, and ready to assist with the investigation of his own perfect crime. Exactly so, by emphasizing the impossibility of the murder, he directed all attention toward the puzzle of method while obscuring the actual mechanical solution. His professional authority lent credibility to his misdirection, and his apparent cooperation placed him above suspicion. Holmes turned from the window with sudden decision. "Inspector Lestrade must be informed immediately, though I fear he will resist releasing Arthur Pembroke without more concrete proof than theoretical reconstruction. We require evidence that will demonstrate Blackwood's guilt beyond reasonable doubt. What do you propose? A trap, Watson, but one that exploits our suspect's greatest weakness, his professional pride in the very mechanism he used to commit murder. Blackwood believes his secret is safe with young Pembroke in custody, but he cannot resist the opportunity to ensure that no incriminating evidence remains hidden within the temple structure." Holmes moved to the writing desk and began composing a carefully worded message. This note, purporting to come from Arthur Pembroke's solicitor, will suggest that new mechanical evidence has been discovered within the temple that could exonerate the accused and implicate another party. We shall ensure this information reaches Blackwood through seemingly innocent channels. You believe he will return to the scene? I am certain of it. A man who commits murder using his own architectural innovation cannot resist protecting that creation from exposure, even at considerable personal risk. Tonight, Watson, the room without walls will finally reveal its most carefully guarded secret. As Holmes completed his preparations for the trap, I could not shake the feeling that we stood on the threshold of one of his most remarkable solutions. The impossible murder in the temple was about to yield to methodical investigation, but the final confrontation would require all of Holmes's considerable skills to bring this architectural murderer to justice. The fog was beginning to lift from the garden, and through the study windows the temple's marble columns gleamed pale in the gathering dusk. Soon, those same columns that had concealed a perfect crime would become the instrument of its revelation. Holmes's preparations for the evening's work proceeded with characteristic precision. The carefully crafted message, purporting to come from Arthur Pembroke's legal counsel, suggested that an independent structural engineer had discovered irregularities in the temple's construction that might exonerate the accused. The note was dispatched through channels that would ensure its arrival at Blackwood's office by late afternoon, giving our quarry sufficient time to contemplate the implications of potential exposure. Inspector Lestrade arrived at Pembroke Manor as dusk settled over the grounds, his scepticism evident in every line of his sharp features. "Holmes, I confess this theory seems far-fetched," he protested as we reviewed the evening's arrangements. "Blackwood has cooperated fully throughout our investigation. You're asking me to believe he orchestrated this entire affair as elaborate misdirection." "Consider the evidence without prejudice." "Or, Inspector," Holmes replied calmly. "Who possessed intimate knowledge of the temple's mechanical secrets? Who had both professional motive and personal access? Who consistently directed our attention toward impossibility rather than practical solution?" The answer to each question points to the same individual. Holmes positioned us in Sir Reginald's former bedchamber, the elevated windows providing an unobstructed prospect of the temple grounds. The room was kept in complete darkness, our presence concealed, while the garden below lay faintly illuminated by intermittent moonlight filtering through drifting clouds. Lestrade stationed constables at strategic points around the perimeter, though their orders were to remain hidden until signalled. The waiting proved interminable. But the hall clock marked each passing hour with maddening precision while we maintained our silent vigil. Holmes remained motionless beside the window, his keen eyes never wavering from their surveillance of the ghostly temple. The white circle of sand gleamed pale against the darker lawn, its pristine surface unmarked since Wright's evening raking. At precisely 11:30, Holmes's hand closed upon my arm. "There, Watson," he whispered. "Observe the shadow moving along the eastern boundary." Through the darkness, I distinguished a figure approaching with extraordinary caution, keeping to the deepest shadows cast by ornamental trees and shrubbery. The man paused frequently, clearly listening for any sound that might indicate watchers or patrols. As he drew nearer, the distinctive silhouette of Edmund Blackwood became unmistakable. At reaching the sand's edge, Blackwood surveyed the pristine surface that would register any crossing. Rather than attempt to traverse it, he circled to the temple's rear, where the columns cast their deepest shadows. Holmes leaned forward intently, his breathing barely audible. "Watch the columns themselves, Watson," he murmured. "You are about to witness the ghost pass through solid marble." Even forewarned, the movement was so subtle I might have missed it entirely. One of the rear columns appeared to shift almost imperceptibly, creating a narrow gap in what had seemed solid construction. Blackwood pressed himself against the marble and slipped sideways through the opening, disappearing into the temple's interior as the column rotated back to its original position. "Now we have him," Holmes said with quiet satisfaction. Signal Lestrade to close the perimeter, but instruct his men to remain concealed. I wish to observe what our architectural murderer accomplishes within his own creation." A dim light appeared briefly within the temple as Blackwood lit a small lantern, its glow barely visible through the columns. We could discern movement as he worked at something near the column base, apparently examining or adjusting the hidden mechanism. The activity continued for perhaps 15 minutes before the light was extinguished, and we heard the faint scraping of stone against stone as the column began its rotation. "He believes his secret remains safe," Holmes observed. "Now comes the moment of truth, Watson." We descended swiftly through the darkened house, emerging into the garden just as Blackwood reached the lawn's edge. Holmes's voice cut through the night silence with commanding authority. "Mr. Blackwood, your architectural consultation is concluded." The figure froze, then slowly turned as constables emerged from their concealed positions, effectively surrounding him. In the light of their lanterns, Blackwood's features were clearly visible, his expression shifting from shock to calculation, and finally to grim resignation. "Mr. Holmes," he said, with forced composure, "I was merely conducting a final structural inspection to ensure no evidence had been overlooked. Such thoroughness is proper professional practice." Holmes approached until he stood directly before the trapped man. "Then perhaps you can explain why this inspection required entering through a rotating column mechanism that only you knew existed, or why such diligence demanded midnight secrecy." Blackwood's professional facade cracked visibly. "You cannot prove anything beyond my presence here, which I have already explained." "On the contrary," Holmes replied with deadly calm. "The graphite lubricant on your hands matches the substance found at the crime scene. The specialized tools in your possession are designed specifically for adjusting the bronze pivot mechanisms you yourself invented. Most significantly, your own correspondence with Sir Reginald documents both your architectural innovations and his theft of your intellectual property." The revelation struck Blackwood like a physical blow. His shoulders sagged as complete exposure became undeniable. "He stole everything," he said quietly, years of accumulated bitterness evident in his voice. "My designs, my innovations, how my professional reputation. When he refused even to acknowledge my contributions, I used my own creation to deliver justice." "Not justice, Mr. Blackwood," Holmes replied gravely. "Revenge, and in pursuing it, you nearly condemned an innocent man." As Lestrade's constables moved forward, the brilliant architect who had created both an impossible murder and its perfect solution stood revealed as a man whose exceptional talents had been corrupted by wounded pride and obsession. The room without walls had finally surrendered its most carefully guarded secret. Inspector Lestrade moved to secure Blackwood with handcuffs, but the architect submitted with a dignity that bordered on defiance. The moonlight, filtering through the drifting clouds, cast an ethereal glow upon the temple columns, transforming the scene of solved mystery into something almost theatrical. Blackwood stood framed between the pale marble pillars, his tall figure a stark silhouette against the gleaming stone that had both inspired his genius and witnessed his downfall. "You believe you have triumphed, Mr. Holmes," Blackwood said quietly, his voice carrying neither anger nor desperation, but rather the measured tone of a professional acknowledging superior skill. "Yet understand this. Had justice been served 3 years ago, none of this tragedy would have been necessary. Sir Reginald stole not merely my architectural innovations, but my entire professional future. Holmes regarded him with that peculiar mixture of intellectual respect and moral condemnation I had observed in previous cases involving criminals of exceptional ability.
Many men suffer professional injustice, Mr. Blackwood, yet few choose murder as their remedy. Your grievance may explain your actions, but it cannot excuse them. You employed remarkable talent in service of a fundamentally ignoble purpose. Lestrade stepped forward impatiently. Save your justifications for the magistrate. For now you will explain exactly how this business was accomplished, or we shall reconstruct it ourselves through evidence alone. A faint smile touched Blackwood's lips, suggesting that professional pride warred with his predicament. Inspector, you have already reconstructed the essential elements through Mr. Holmes's deductions. Yet if I am to be condemned for this act,
I would prefer my work be properly understood rather than reduced to sensational speculation. Holmes gestured toward the temple with characteristic precision. Then let us examine your creation under proper illumination. Watson, bring the lantern closer. Every aspect must be documented accurately for the official record. Under Blackwood's reluctant guidance, we returned to the rear of the temple, where the crucial column cast its deepest shadow. To my untrained eye, it remained indistinguishable from its 11 companions, yet Holmes immediately located the nearly invisible seam that marked its mechanical nature. Here, Blackwood indicated, his voice taking on the instructional tone of a master craftsman explaining his work. The outer casing is genuine Carrara marble, but the structural core consists of bronze mounted on a central pivot mechanism. The entire column is counterweighted and balanced to allow silent rotation with minimal physical effort. Holmes knelt to examine the base more closely, his fingers tracing the hairline joint with scientific precision. And the operating mechanism? Concealed within this recessed groove, Blackwood replied, indicating a depression so subtle it would escape casual observation. A hidden latch releases the pivot catch. Once freed, the column rotates precisely 30 degrees, creating an aperture sufficient for human passage, while maintaining the structure's apparent solidity. Following his instructions, Holmes located the concealed control and applied gentle pressure. The whisper of stone against bronze was barely audible as the massive column began its rotation, revealing the dark void within its marble shell. The effect was profoundly unsettling, as though the temple itself were betraying its architectural integrity. Remarkable engineering, Holmes observed, stepping back to appreciate the mechanism's elegance. The craftsmanship is exceptional, requiring not merely theoretical knowledge but intimate understanding of structural dynamics and mechanical precision. Lestrade's patience, never abundant under the best circumstances, was clearly wearing thin. Enough admiration for criminal ingenuity. Explain how you used this contraption to commit murder without leaving a trace. Blackwood's demeanor shifted as he began his confession, with the professional pride giving way to something approaching relief at finally revealing his carefully guarded secret. I arrived at Pembroke Manor late that afternoon under the pretext of reviewing minor architectural concerns. Sir Reginald granted me access to the temple, believing I wished to verify some detail of the original construction. In truth, I was preparing my stage. His voice grew distant as he recalled the events. I concealed myself within the column chamber just before 7 o'clock, entering from the rear while Wright gathered his tools. Once inside, I rotated the mechanism closed from the interior controls. The space is cramped but adequate for temporary concealment. Through narrow inspection slits, and I could observe the entire temple while remaining completely invisible from any external vantage point. Holmes listened intently, his grey eyes bright with professional interest, despite the horrific nature of the confession. You remained hidden while Wright raked the sand, ensuring no subsequent disturbance would betray your presence. Precisely. Now, when Sir Reginald entered at 7:30 and settled into his customary reading, I waited nearly 30 minutes before revealing myself. I had intended merely to demand acknowledgement of my stolen designs, to force him to admit his theft before witnesses I planned to summon, but when I emerged from the column and confronted him, Sir Reginald showed no remorse whatsoever. Blackwood's voice hardened with remembered fury. He laughed at my desperation, mocked my professional decline, and declared he would see me prosecuted for trespassing if I did not depart immediately. Something broke within me at that moment. The stiletto I carried for protection seemed to move of its own accord. One precise thrust between the ribs, angled upward to pierce the heart, and his laughter ceased forever. The confession continued with clinical detachment as Blackwood described retreating into his architectural hiding place, waiting in darkness while the household discovered the body, then simply walking away through the confusion as though he had just arrived to offer assistance. Holmes nodded slowly, his expression grave with understanding. Your subsequent insertion into the official investigation was masterfully executed. By emphasizing the crime's impossibility, or you directed attention away from the mechanical solution you alone comprehended. As Lestrade's constables prepared to lead Blackwood away, the condemned architect paused to address Holmes directly. Mr. Holmes, I acknowledge defeat at your hands with professional respect. The Temple of Truth was my masterwork, and you alone possess the insight to penetrate its secrets. That recognition provides some consolation in my ruin. Holmes regarded him with an expression mixing contempt and reluctant pity. Your architectural genius was considerable, Mr. Blackwood. Had you channeled that brilliance toward creation rather than destruction, your name might have been remembered with honor rather than infamy. As the police carriage departed into the November night, carrying its prisoner toward inevitable justice,
I reflected upon the tragic waste of exceptional talent corrupted by wounded pride and obsessive vengeance. The room without walls had finally surrendered its most carefully guarded secret, but the human cost of that revelation would resonate far beyond this single night's resolution. The following morning brought Arthur Pembroke's release from custody, though the ordeal had visibly aged the young man beyond his years. Holmes and I accompanied Inspector Lestrade to Richmond Station, where the formal exoneration took place with Miss Caroline Ashworth waiting tearfully to embrace her cousin. The relief in her pale features was profound, yet tinged with the sorrow that would forever mark the household's memory of these tragic events. Lestrade, displaying uncharacteristic humility, offered genuine contrition for the wrongful arrest.
The planted evidence was expertly concealed, Mr. Pembroke. Even the most thorough investigation might have been deceived by Blackwood's machinations. As we returned to Pembroke Manor for the final time, Holmes addressed the question that had troubled him throughout our investigation. Mr. Pembroke, your conversation with the gardener Wright on the evening of the murder suggested knowledge you chose not to share. I require complete honesty now that justice has been served. The young man's composure faltered as he confessed his earlier observations. 3 weeks before Uncle Reginald's death, I witnessed him entering the temple through what appeared to be solid marble. When I attempted closer examination, he forbade my approach with unusual vehemence. After the murder, I feared my account would sound mad, or worse, implicate me further in a crime I did not commit. Holmes nodded with satisfaction at having this final puzzle piece confirmed. Your silence, and while understandable, might have expedited our investigation considerably. However, the truth emerged through other channels, as truth invariably does. During our return journey to London, I pressed Holmes for clarification, of the psychological trap that had ensured Blackwood's capture. How could you be certain he would return that precise night to examine his mechanism? Holmes smiled with evident satisfaction. Because, Watson, I counted upon the most reliable of human weaknesses, professional vanity under threat. Consider Blackwood's position after Arthur's arrest. He believed his masterpiece secure, his chosen scapegoat imprisoned, the world admiring his insoluble puzzle. Then suddenly, he learns that fresh mechanical evidence threatens to exonerate Pembroke and expose his creation. To a mind of his temperament, the suggestion that some unknown engineer had penetrated his design would be intolerable. He could not endure the thought that his carefully constructed illusion might be dismantled by an inferior intelligence. "The dust rings you discovered on the temple floor," I continued, "and the verdigris traces, how did these confirm your mechanical theory?" Holmes leaned forward, with the enthusiasm he always displayed when explaining his deductions. "The dust rings were crucial, Watson. They marked where Sir Reginald's reading table had stood before being moved to allow the column's rotation. In a space protected from disturbance, dust settles with mathematical precision. The slight misalignment between the table's final position and those ghostly circles proved furniture had been manipulated where no intruder could logically have entered. The verdigris confirmed physical contact between Sir Reginald's shoe and the bronze interior mechanism, impossible unless the column had been opened during his presence. As our train approached London, Holmes grew contemplative. "The most telling evidence was psychological, Watson. Why did Blackwood insert himself into our investigation rather than simply disappearing? Because the artist cannot bear separation from his masterpiece. He required an audience to admire the impossibility he had crafted, and that vanity became the instrument of his destruction. Upon reaching Baker Street, until we found the familiar comfort of our lodgings a welcome relief after days of intensive investigation." Holmes settled into his chair with evident satisfaction, selecting his pipe with characteristic precision. The November fog, which had shrouded our initial departure, seemed finally to have lifted completely, leaving the city bathed in that peculiar clarity that sometimes follows extended atmospheric oppression. "The room without walls has yielded its secrets, Watson," Holmes observed, lighting his pipe thoughtfully. "Yet I confess the resolution brings less satisfaction than usual. Blackwood's architectural genius might have contributed significantly to human progress had it not been perverted toward murderous purpose. Instead, his name will be remembered only as a footnote to criminal history." I settled into my own chair, grateful for the familiar disorder of our sitting room after the stark elegance of Pembroke Manor. Perhaps there is instruction in documenting how brilliance may be corrupted when professional grievance transforms into obsessive vengeance. Your methods demonstrate that no crime, however ingeniously conceived, can withstand methodical analysis. Holmes smiled faintly, his grey eyes reflecting the firelight as evening shadows gathered around us. "Then you must chronicle this affair with your usual attention to dramatic detail, Watson. Future readers may find value in understanding how an impossible murder was rendered merely improbable, then finally inevitable, through the application of logical reasoning to apparently contradictory evidence." He reached for his violin, drawing the bow across the strings to produce a low, questioning note that seemed to echo the melancholy of the London streets beyond our windows. "Sir Reginald built his Temple of Truth to demonstrate openness to the world, yet died because he had constructed a prison for another man's genius. The most impenetrable walls, Watson, are not those made of stone, but those built from our own secrets and deceptions." As Holmes began a complex, haunting melody, I reflected upon how this investigation had once again demonstrated the remarkable powers of observation and deduction that made him the foremost consulting detective of our age. The case was closed, but already I could sense his restless mind turning toward whatever new mystery London's endless wickedness might provide. During the weeks following Edmund Blackwood's arrest brought a swift conclusion to the legal proceedings that had captivated London's attention. The trial at the Old Bailey drew considerable public interest, with newspapers chronicling every detail of what they termed the impossible murder of Richmond. Holmes attended several sessions, though he confessed to me afterward that he found the theatrical aspects of courtroom drama rather tedious compared to the pure intellectual satisfaction of investigation itself. Blackwood's confession proved comprehensive, corroborating every element of Holmes's brilliant deduction. The architect displayed no remorse for his crime, maintaining to the end that Sir Reginald's theft of his innovations had justified the ultimate retribution. The jury required less than an hour to return a verdict of guilty, even though the sentence of death was later commuted to life imprisonment owing to questions regarding his mental state during the crime's commission. Arthur Pembroke and Miss Caroline Ashworth gradually resumed their lives at the manor, though both confessed during a subsequent visit that the temple had become an object of profound unease. Young Pembroke eventually ordered the structure completely dismantled, declaring that no monument to his uncle's memory should bear such sinister associations. The rotating columns were donated to the British Museum's architectural collection, where they remain as testament to both engineering brilliance and its potential corruption. Inspector Lestrade visited Baker Street on a crisp December evening, bearing a bottle of excellent port and genuine gratitude for Holmes's intervention in preventing a grievous miscarriage of justice. As we sat before our familiar fire, he raised the question that had troubled him throughout the investigation. "Holmes," he said, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass, "when did you first suspect Blackwood specifically? His arrival seemed so natural, so helpful to our inquiry." Holmes considered the question with characteristic precision. "The first genuine suspicion arose from his behavior at the crime scene, Inspector. He displayed no curiosity about the murder itself, focusing entirely on the architectural impossibility. A truly innocent consultant would have shown some human reaction to violent death, yet Blackwood exhibited only professional interest in the puzzle."
That emotional detachment suggested either remarkable callousness or guilty knowledge. I interjected with my own observation. Yet you allowed the investigation to proceed through multiple stages before revealing your suspicions. Why not confront him immediately? Holmes smiled with that familiar expression of pedagogical patience. Because suspicion requires proof, Watson, and proof demands evidence that will withstand legal scrutiny. Moreover, I needed to understand not merely who committed the crime, but precisely how it was accomplished. Only by reconstructing the complete sequence could we ensure Blackwood's conviction and Pembroke's exoneration. Thomas Wright recovered fully from his injuries and resumed his gardening duties, though he never again maintained the circular bed of sand that had once surrounded the temple.
The space was transformed into a simple rose garden, its peaceful beauty offering no hint of the sinister events that had unfolded there. Wright often remarked to visitors that he preferred honest flowers to deceptive marble, a sentiment that captured the household's collective desire to move beyond architectural mysteries toward simpler truths. As Lestrade departed into the December night, Holmes moved to his violin, drawing forth a melancholy air that seemed to capture both the satisfaction of solved mystery and the persistent sadness of human folly. The case had demonstrated, he observed, a fundamental truth about human nature and the corruption of exceptional talent. "Blackwood possessed genuine brilliance, Watson," he mused, lowering his instrument. "Had he channeled that gift toward creation rather than destruction, his name might have been remembered with honor rather than infamy. Instead, wounded pride and obsessive vengeance transformed architectural genius into murderous deception. The conversation drifted to broader philosophical considerations as the evening progressed. Holmes grew reflective, his sharp features softened by firelight and the mellowing influence of excellent port. This case demonstrates how we construct elaborate barriers between ourselves and the world, believing these defenses provide security. Yet often our most carefully built walls become prisons of our own making. Sir Reginald's temple without walls paradoxically became the most confining space imaginable, while Blackwood's architectural genius imprisoned him within an obsession that ultimately destroyed him. In the weeks that followed, I began organizing my notes into coherent narrative form. The case represented one of Holmes's most remarkable achievements, demonstrating how apparently supernatural impossibility yields to patient analysis and methodical reasoning. Yet it also illustrated the tragic consequences when exceptional talent is corrupted by wounded pride and obsessive vengeance. Holmes occasionally returned to the mechanical principles involved, using them to illustrate lectures on the importance of questioning apparent impossibilities. The room without walls had yielded its secrets completely, he would say, yet its lessons about human nature and the corruption of genius remained subjects worthy of continued contemplation. The fog that had shrouded London during our initial journey to Richmond never quite returned with the same oppressive intensity. Yet perhaps this was mere meteorological coincidence, or perhaps the city itself seemed lighter once justice had been served and truth finally revealed. Whatever the explanation, I found myself grateful for the clarity that followed darkness, both literal and metaphorical. As Holmes returned to his chemical experiments and I to my medical practice, the familiar rhythms of Baker Street life resumed their comfortable pattern. Yet the memory of that impossible murder lingered, a reminder of how the most impenetrable mysteries yield to methodical investigation and unwavering logic. The game, as Holmes was fond of saying, was never truly over. It merely paused between cases waiting for the next puzzle that would emerge from London's endless capacity for both human ingenuity and human folly. The Temple of Truth had fallen.
But somewhere in the great metropolis, another mystery was already taking shape, ready to challenge once again the remarkable powers of the world's first consulting detective.